Today, today we're looking at Mark chapter 6. Mark 6. We haven't hit every single section of Mark, but we've gotten most of it, right? And so we're going through kind of this the life of Jesus as told by Mark. I'm gonna be honest, the reason I picked Mark is because it's the shortest of all the Gospels. And there's a lot in there. Mark's a guy of action. So one of his favorite phrases is immediately. He's quick and he gets to it and he tells the story. Last week we looked at Jairus, who was a synagogue ruler, and he had a daughter that was sick, 12-year-old daughter that was sick, and Jesus goes and is walking towards healing her, and then there's this lady that's been bleeding for 12 years, goes to the crowd making everybody unclean. She touches the hem of his garment. Jesus is like, who touched me? He spends time, says, hey, daughter, your faith has made you well. And it's almost you forgot all about Jairus there for a little bit because it spent so much time on his interaction with the lady. But he does go to the little girl, and the people are saying she's dead, and Jesus shows that he has authority even over death. So we get to chapter 6, and we'll just read the first 6 verses here. It says, Jesus left there, and he went to his hometown, accompanied by his disciples. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were amazed. Where did this man get these things, they asked. What's this wisdom that has been given him, that he even does miracles? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, only in his hometown, among his relatives, and in his own house is a prophet without honor. He cannot do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he was amazed at their lack of faith. So Jesus is journeying into his hometown here after a series of miracles. Right? We just seen a bunch of miracles that had taken place. We named some of them. We now see this different side. In his hometown, many of the people just aren't that impressed with him. Although Mark notes that those who heard him were amazed, there's very little faith to be found in his hometown of Nazareth. The questions brought forth, where did this man get these things? Now, if you notice, that's about the third time we've heard a question like that. The very first one was in the synagogue in chapter 1. After he cast out a demon, the people go, what is this? A new teaching and with authority? And then whenever he calms the storm, the disciples in the boat ask, who is this? And now, here in his hometown, they're so familiar with him, at least they think, that they're like, where'd he get this stuff from? You see the difference there? At the first couple of questions was this progression of faith, and now you're like, oh, where'd this guy get this? Where'd he come up with that? It's almost as though they are so familiar with him, they have no interest in knowing who he is. This seems to indicate the heart of the people, right? They have no desire to really know who he is. Just where's he come up with this stuff, right? You ever been so familiar in a place? Everybody's like, yeah, we know you. And you go back, and to them, you're still the same old person. It's interesting to note Mark's description of what Jesus did or did not do. Mark chose to use the expression, Jesus could not do any miracles there, except to lay his hands on a few sick people to make them well. Now, Matthew says he would not do, or he did not do any miracles there. But Mark writes Jesus could not do any miracles there, except lay his hands on a few sick people. It shows this contrast to all these chapters leading up to this. Because What have we seen so far? We've seen Jesus silence a demon in a synagogue. We've seen him heal a town and cast out many demons. We've seen him cure a leper. We've seen him heal a paralytic, heal a man with a withered hand, calm a storm, exorcise a legion of demons, and raise a dead girl to life again. And now here it is. Jesus couldn't do anything there. Couldn't really do any miracles there. Because they have a lack of faith. And it says that Jesus was amazed at their lack of faith. You ever wonder what it's like? How do you amaze Jesus? How does Jesus get amazed? Well, there's two times that I can think of off the top of my head when that's recorded. One's right here. He's amazed at their lack of faith. The other time, it says that Jesus was amazed at a man's faith. So faith amazes Jesus from those couple of verses there. And it's just as faith has this positive effect whenever it's present, whenever it's not present, there can be maybe an adverse effect. What I'm saying is Jesus wasn't limited. It wasn't that it was impossible to do the miracles, but the people wouldn't have received it in the same manner. It was still, oh, that's just Jesus. Yeah, we know that guy. He's the carpenter's son. And what's interesting here is Jesus, when he enters his hometown, he goes into the synagogue. It says that he went into the synagogue and began to teach. After this instance, after the people reject him in his hometown, he never again enters a synagogue. Kind of a very interesting change of events. Because that was his custom. He went in and he would always go into the synagogue and he'd begin to teach. Here, they're rejecting him. And he's, from this moment on, he doesn't go into the synagogue anymore. They refuse to see Jesus for who he is. They just want to see his family unit. They have eyes that are very limited. Sometimes we can have limited eyes like that, right? We just see Jesus as however we want to see him, rather than who he really is, right? So we're like, that's some dude that lived a long time ago, but it really has no effect on me today. They just saw that he was a common worker in a common family, just a common guy. And Mark do you remember a few weeks ago whenever we talked about the parable of the sower? This guy's going and he's sowing seed. Jesus is telling the story. And he's like, some fell on this type of ground and others fell on rocky ground. We're kind of seeing that played out in all the people that we've met since then. We're seeing what type of soil a person's heart has through Jairus, through the disciples on the boat, through his hometown. We're kind of seeing all of this played out here. Now, I want to kind of hone in on this, the familiarity of Jesus. You see, they saw him, he was so familiar to them that there couldn't be anything special about him. Sometimes I wonder if we've allowed ourselves to make the story of God, the story of Jesus, become so familiar that it has no impact on our lives. All right? We hear it over and over. We see it. We hear people talk about it. We've read it or had it read to us. It's become so familiar that we don't even know anymore the impact that it should have upon us. There was this archaeological dig, and they were digging in the city. This is around the time of Hosea, the prophet Hosea. And they dug up this inscription that said, "To Yahweh God and his Asherah. What they determined there, what these biblical archaeologists kind of looked at, was that Yahweh, God, had become so common, just like any other god to them, that they're like, well, let's give him a wife. You know, every man needs a good lady. He had become so common to them that they created him in their image rather than understanding that we are created in his image. That's kind of what's taking place here. They're looking at Jesus and they're like, oh, yeah, Joseph and Mary's boy. That guy. He's just a common guy. His sisters are here with us. We know his brothers, mom, dad. You know what? They weren't even married when he came around. That's all the stuff that's circling around his story. And I wonder sometimes if we make the story of Jesus so common to us, that we get so familiar with it, that we act the same way. I mean, we might not go, oh man, I reject you, but we don't really make any changes. And so in essence, we're saying the same thing. I don't know. It's just a question. Has the message become so familiar that when you hear it, you're no different? We just endure it. He's going to leave his hometown here. And by the way, that word amazed, I dug into it a little deeper. And it means bitterly disappointed in this instance. Whenever it's used in a negative connotation, that he's, like, oh, that amazes me. Like in a negative way, it means bitterly disappointed at their lack of faith. Yeah. Breaks his heart. Then Jesus went around teaching from village to village. This is village to village, not synagogue to synagogue anymore. Calling the 12 to him, he sent them out 2 by 2, and he gave them authority over evil spirits. These were his instructions. Take nothing for your journey but a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in your belt. Wear sandals, but not an extra tunic. Whenever you enter a house, stay there until you leave that town. And if any place will not welcome you or listen to you, shake the dust off your feet when you leave as a testimony against them. They went out and they preached that people should repent. They drove out many demons and they anointed many sick people and they healed them. So after Jesus is leaving his hometown, he begins teaching village to village. He's calling his 12 together and he's sending them out 2 by 2. And there might be a couple of reasons for this. It might just be, kind of this accountability thing. But in that time, you needed to have a witness with you at all times. Like in court, if you had 2 witnesses, then that holds a lot more than the he said, she said kind of thing, right? A lot more weight whenever 2 people are saying something. So perhaps it brings credibility to their testimony. We won't read the verse, but Deuteronomy 17 verse 6 talks about that, of the testimony of 2 witnesses being important, being strong. And Jesus says, don't take anything with you except a staff. It's like he's saying, all you need is your faith. Don't take your money bags. Don't take an extra coat. Nothing. Just go. Take your staff and your faith and go. And they preach this message of repentance, and it says that they cast out demons, they heal sick people. This is the first time the disciples are out on their own, at least in Mark's gospel. And it's time for the disciples' faith to be tested, and they're sent out 2 by 2 to preach and perform miracles. And we got like this weird section after this that's going to talk about John the Baptist being beheaded. It's just weird because it's like, and he sent them out and they preached, they healed many sick, and they anointed the sick, and they healed people. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, John the Baptist was beheaded. It's like it tells a story. Now, I always try to get you guys out a little earlier than this hour, so I won't read the full thing there, all right? But there's a guy, Mark calls him King Herod. All right? King Herod, he knows about Jesus. Jesus at this time, at least in King Herod's eyes, has become really famous, become well known. And some were saying that John the Baptist was raised from the dead. And others were saying, no, that's Elijah. But when Herod heard somebody say, that Jesus is John the Baptist, it really played with his head a little bit. No pun intended there, by the way. Because he had John the Baptist beheaded. See, he was throwing this big party, King Herod was. And John, being the kind of guy he is, said, hey man, you've been hooking up with your brother's wife. You shouldn't be doing that. Don't do that. That's not right. That lady's name was Herodias. Her daughter dances at the party. Herod likes to dance. That she does. And he says, I'll give you anything you want up to half my kingdom. And she goes to her mom's like, what do I ask for? Said, what about John the Baptist's head on a platter? Oh, these are some sick, twisted people right here. And that's what they ask for. And so that's what she's given. Now I think that this long break right here in this story, because it goes back to the disciples coming back and telling, I think that this is to say that some time had passed. Right? That they had been out the disciples had been out on their own a little bit now. And I wonder if the thought of John the Baptist and what Herod had done still guilts him. Because he freaks out a little bit whenever he's like, somebody says, Jesus is John the Baptist resurrected. I mean, he's like, whoa. He's a little scared. Got some guilt. The idea of Jesus being well known, it stands opposed to the reception that he got in his hometown. Here is this evil king. He's actually a tetrarch, not a king. He's the guy who kind of calls himself a king. Knows about Jesus' fame and kind of believes something special about Jesus. But they're in his hometown. They're like, oh, it's just Jesus. No big deal. Yeah, this will be a different, that king that sought to kill him, whenever he's an infant, whenever you're reading, I believe it's Matthew's account of that, he says, those that seek to kill you are no more. Like they've passed on. So this is, I don't know if this is the same family line, but, so this is a different person. And it's just interesting that he's viewing himself as King Herod. And Jesus setting up the kingdom of God. It's almost like Mark's using a little bit of sarcasm here. He's like, King Herod tried to stop the kingdom from coming, but the kingdom still came. there's this recurring theme of true discipleship that comes up. But Mark uses like this sarcasm, like this guy thinks he's king and thinks he can stop the kingdom from coming. But Jesus was the kingdom, bringing in his kingdom. After demonstrating the cost of discipleship, we're kind of given through flashbacks. Verse 30, the apostles gathered around Jesus, and they reported to him all they had done and taught. And then because so many people were coming and going, they did not even have a chance to eat. And Jesus said, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place to eat. And they go away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. Many who saw them recognized them and ran on foot to the towns and got there ahead of them. Jesus landed. He saw a large crowd. He had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach many things. And Jesus said, this is a remote place. It's already very late. They're saying to Jesus, this is a remote place. It's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding communities and eat. And Jesus says, you give them something to eat. So these disciples had already gone off on their own and performed miracles, right? And now they're back with Jesus, and Jesus is trying to hear their story. He's just trying to get alone with them to kind of hear their story. So he gets in a boat, just like he did before, and he's trying to go and be alone with the disciples to hear them. They go to the other side, and all the crowd ran around the lake or the pond before they could get there. And there's this large crowd that's gathered there. And they say, Jesus, send them away so they can eat. And Jesus says, you give them something to eat. And then their response is, but it would take 8 months of wages for each one to have maybe just a bite. So they're already doubting again. Back in the presence of Jesus, after they themselves had been out on their own, doing all this stuff. And now they're back face to face with Jesus, and they still have the doubts. Listen, I don't know about you, but I'm going to be honest. It's kind of encouraging to me because there are so many times when I'm like, yeah, I've seen God do some amazing things in people's lives. And I've seen him do some miraculous things in people's lives. But when you get down to it, I still got a little doubt. Maybe you do too. I don't know. I don't know your story. Jesus asks how many loaves they have, and they find out they have 5 loaves and 2 fish. And from that 5 loaves and 2 fish, they feed thousands of people, right? John says that there's 5,000. Matthew says 5,000 men, not counting women and children. So, a lot of people. We don't know the exact number, but if Matthew says 5,000 men, not counting women and children, and you're like trying to figure, well, at least half of them were married, and probably a half of those had at least one kid. There are probably 8,000 to 10,000 people there at least. That's kind of a conservative estimate. And then there's so much blessing that there's crumbs left over. And here's where I've got some questions for you. Going back to the beginning of this. How familiar are you with the story of Jesus? Everybody heard it, right? If you've ever watched a movie in December, you've probably at least heard about the gifts that he's given, Jesus being born. So we get kind of familiar with the story. And then around Easter, even if you aren't a church person or a Bible reading person, you've probably heard about him dying on a cross and rising again. See, sometimes that story becomes so familiar to us that it's nothing more than just a story. It's just something that sounds cool. It's just something that's interesting and maybe or maybe not true. And we get so caught up in the familiarity of it that we lose the wonder of it all. I don't know if you can ever remember a time when you were just encompassed with wonder about life. All right? Where you're like, man, I've got these dreams and these goals. You might have been tiny at the time. All right? And I don't know. I'm trying to think of all the things I wanted to be when I was little. Right? That show, remember this show Fall Guy with Lee Majors? Yeah, if you're like under 40, you're like, no. All right? So I'm like, yeah, I want to be a stuntman like that. Right? But I also wanted to be a fireman, an astronaut. Like, life was filled with wonder. Like, what will I be? All right? What? And so you're filled with this awe and this wonder, but then life beats you up a little bit. Right? You had some good goals, you had some dreams, you had some plans, you felt like maybe these things could happen, but then life just beat you down. And you became so used to being beat down that you developed what psychologists call learned helplessness. Anybody heard that term? Learned helplessness? It's where it's like we give it our best effort, but things keep failing, and so we just quit trying. There was this experiment that was done where they played this really loud, annoying sound, and they used 3 groups of people as their test dummies, all right? Whatever you're going to call them. They're subjects, yeah. All right, and in the first room that had the loud thing going on, they gave them a button, but you had to press the button 4 times before the sound actually stopped. In the second room, the button was just broken. And in the third room, there was no sound at all. And so, the third group is like, oh man, they were the lucky ones, no sound at all. But then they run the same test on the same group of people in the same rooms, except this time they have a lever that you pull. And everybody's lever worked. But guess what happened? The people that heard no sound at all the first time were the only ones that pulled the lever. Why? Because the other groups had a broken lever, had a broken button, so they assumed that the lever is going to be broke too. And so they were doing everything that they could to not hear the sound. They'd have their fingers in their ears, they would yell themselves, trying to drown out the noise of this just a crazy, annoying sound. And look, maybe you went through life and you've tried, and you've tried, and you've tried, but you keep coming up short. You keep coming up empty. And now you're like, what's the point? And yet the noise of the world keeps ringing. And we find ourselves in the corner with our fingers over our ears going, nah, 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 trying to drown it out. Because we've learned helplessness. They heard the story of Jesus and it had become so familiar to them. And he was just the carpenter's son. Not the Messiah that could set us free. Not the one that can save us from this noise that tries to drown us. But instead, just some guy. And they got stuck. Stuck in the helpless hopelessness that they felt. So I don't know where you're at. I don't know what your life is like. Some of you I know personally, and others of you, I don't know you personally. But if you're a human being, which looking around, I believe we all are, except for, there's a couple of dogs, but they went to sleep a long time ago. Then you have hurt in your life. You have pain in your life. You have struggles that you've gone through, and you felt hopeless and you felt helpless. And maybe you're like, well, I went to church before, it didn't help. I've prayed this prayer before and it did nothing for me. I've gotten close to somebody before and they burned me. And so you've learned helplessness. Well, look, the people in this town weren't interested in knowing who Jesus was. They're just like, where does he get off saying this stuff and doing these things? So I just want to encourage you and I include myself in there, to not allow the story to be so familiar that we lose the awe and the wonder of who Jesus is. All right? So I'm going to pray for you guys. Pray for us, and then we can go, okay?